Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive and truly fascinating historical transformation. We're going to look at exactly how the British presence in India evolved from a simple mercantile trading company into a highly structured, intensely bureaucratic ruling power. It's the story of how an absolutely massive state-building project was engineered from the ground up. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the shift from trade to conquest, check out the blueprint for the empire, and then dive deep into the administration, the governments, the army, the police, and the judicial system. Finally, we'll wrap up with the lasting legacy of mistrust. All right, part one, from trade to conquest, setting the stage. Before we can really examine the bureaucratic machinery itself, we have to briefly set the stage by looking at the rather violent site-clearing phase that made this entire administrative project possible. So picture this. It's the 15th century. Europe is absolutely desperate for Indian spices, cotton, and silk. This massive demand brought powers like the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British across the oceans. But as you can imagine, the desire to monopolize that immense wealth quickly turned basic coastal trading posts into heavily armed forts. The British East India Company started out with just a single factory in Bengal in 1651, but they soon found themselves morphing from merchants into actual conquerors. This transition wasn't slow either. It happened rapidly through a series of decisive, violent military victories. You've got the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and then Buxar in 1764, which literally handed the British civil and administrative rights over Bengal. Following that, they systematically eliminated their major rivals, ending the Mysore Wars in 1799 and the Maratha Wars by 1819. Just like that, the East India Company established absolute, uncontested supremacy over the subcontinent. Part 2. Blueprint for an Empire. The true motive. Once the dust finally settled on the battlefield, the British faced a monumental new challenge. How do you actually govern this vast, newly conquered territory? Well, to understand the administrative systems they built, we have to grasp their true motive. And it is absolutely crucial to understand this. The complex blueprint we're about to explore was built for one primary reason: to protect British interests and extract wealth. That's it. It wasn't a benevolent system built from the ground up for the welfare of the local Indian population. The entire apparatus of state was explicitly engineered for economic extraction. Which brings us to part 3, government and civil services, building the bureaucracy. Let's see how the British Parliament actually took control of a company's conquests and turned it into a formal civil government. With that financial motive driving everything, the British Parliament started systematically pulling power away from the East India Company. It was a creeping dominance. Back in 1773, the Regulating Act set up a Governor-General and a Supreme Court, taking the very first steps toward formal rule. Skip to 1813, and the company's commercial monopoly is completely abolished. Then the 1833 Charter Act totally changes the game. The Governor-General isn't just managing trade anymore. He's suddenly granted sweeping legislative powers to dictate laws over the entire subcontinent. Finally, by 1853, Parliament effectively strips the East India Company of basically all its remaining authority. What we're seeing is the systematic transition from a corporate enterprise into a massive, centralized state government. But a centralized government needs bureaucrats to actually run it. So Governor-General Cornwallis steps in and launches a highly structured civil service. He strictly separates revenue collection from the judiciary, ensuring officials couldn't exploit both systems. Plus, he cracks down hard on corruption by replacing under-the-table bribes with proper, generous salaries. Later on, Wellesley realizes these officials actually need formal training, so he sets up Fort William College in Calcutta. And eventually, under Dalhousie, the whole system evolves to include competitive examinations mandated by that 1853 Act. They were meticulously building a highly professional, incredibly modern bureaucratic machine. But here is the massive catch. While the civil service was being modernized, they installed a completely impenetrable racial glass ceiling right from day one. The top tier of this new administration, the high-ranking positions in the civil services, the army, the judiciary, were exclusively held by the British. Indian workers, they were entirely restricted to low-paid, general positions like clerks and soldiers right up until 1850. So yeah, the machinery was modern, but access to the control room was strictly, systematically segregated. Part 4, the army and police. Enforcing control. Now, an administration built for extraction absolutely requires physical muscle to enforce its will. Let's look at how this next pillar functioned. The British Indian Army was not built primarily for defense against external threats. Its explicit purpose, according to the historical records, was threefold: conquer the remaining parts of India,
suppress any internal rebellions against the administration, and expand the broader British Empire. It was quite literally the physical enforcement arm of the extraction machine. And what's truly wild is how this force was actually composed. By 1857, the British Empire in India was overwhelmingly powered by Indian manpower. Out of roughly 311,000 soldiers, over 265,000 were Indian. Yet, mirroring the exact same exclusion we just saw in the civil services, Indians in the military were barred from ever rising above the rank of Subedar. The British commanded, and the locals served in the ranks. That identical structural dynamic was heavily applied to domestic law enforcement too. Cornwallis came in, abolished the decentralized, traditional Indian feudal police, and replaced it with a modern top-down department. But the hierarchy? Completely segregated. The British held absolute authority at the district level, acting as the District Superintendent of Police, or DSP. Meanwhile, Indians filled all the subordinate roles: Fajdars, village guards, and sepoys. Basically, the British managed the districts while Indians walked the beat. Part 5. The judicial system, the scales of justice. Let's examine how this control extended directly into the courts, a process initially kickstarted by Warren Hastings. The British essentially imported their own legal frameworks to standardize the subcontinent. They established distinct civil and criminal courts, and in 1793, Cornwallis set up a vast network of provincial and district courts. Crucially, they didn't just build the courts. They actively erased and replaced traditional Hindu and Muslim laws with standardized English legal codes. By 1833, they had formalized these into modern written laws. It was a complete, sweeping overhaul of how justice was even conceptualized in India. And yet again, we see that exact same blueprint of exclusion stamped right onto the judicial system. The courts were uniform and modern, sure, but the human element was deeply divided. British judges presided over the district courts, the provincial courts, and the Supreme Court. Indian judges were strictly confined to lower-level roles, given titles like Munsif and Amin. It actually wasn't until William Bentinck's time that Indians were finally appointed to higher positions in the judiciary. Finally, Part 6, Legacy of Mistrust, the Illusion of Law. This sets up the ultimate consequence of this entire bureaucratic state-building project. So, put all this together, we have a modernized civil service, a structured army, and a formal judiciary. On paper, this brand new administration looked incredibly progressive. The British proudly established a modern rule of law. They enacted uniform laws, the doors to the courts were supposedly open to the general public, and officially, the law stated there was no discrimination based on caste, religion, or class. But here is the crucial reality check. Because the core, underlying motive of this entire apparatus was imperial extraction and control. These modern laws were frequently applied arbitrarily when dealing with Indians. The administrative structure wasn't really utilized to deliver blind justice. It was used to protect and strengthen the British Empire. So for the local population, this supposedly modern system often functioned as nothing more than an illusion. Which brings us to the end of this explainer and leaves us with a pretty profound question. When the very foundations of your civil service, your police departments, and your judicial institutions are built on a bedrock of systemic mistrust, arbitrary application, and deliberate exclusion, how long does that legacy truly last? What happens to a society's relationship with the rule of law when those laws were initially written to control them? It is definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today.